Well, I don't know if it's I enjoy, but I value, I highly appreciate this All Saints service that we do each year on the first Sunday of November. I think I've always loved it, this naming names in worship and lighting a candle in memory of those in our community who have died in the past year. It is a rich and filled with meaning custom for me. Truly, it is a chance for us to acknowledge and honor our grief and also gauge our healing, even as we profess our faith. I've always found this custom meaningful ever since I was first ordained at the much younger age of 27. But now that I've been at it for a while, and I'm more of a mature pastor, who has walked in the valley of the shadow of death with those that I love very much, and who has accompanied many families and individuals as they have walked that journey. This day, this service, carries a lot more meaning for me. For I realize that those whom I call friends or mentors or loved ones, those whom I have known, that number is growing larger and larger, those who have gone before us. The grief can be difficult and heavy at times, and as I look at these candles, well, I am reminded of those individuals. Some memories make us very sad because they left us too soon. Others, as we lit those candles, there are smiles on people's faces for the privilege of having known some of those individuals. Because I think about Allie Davenport, who was a leader in this church, a mother, a faithful Christian witness. She was on my interview committee when I came to be interviewed to be the congregational care pastor. And she had a passion, wanted to know what I felt about making the church very welcoming of all people. Because around this table, she said, everyone is welcome. Or then there was that James Carter, Jimmy Carter, and he had a brother named Billy as well. But he was very poor growing up. And in the 30s, he picked cotton. For 100 pounds of cotton, he got 50 cents. And he said they were so poor that the neighbors would share. And he learned at a very early age the Christian values of caring for the needy and sharing what you have. Or Frank McMichael, he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the last major offensive to end the war. In fact, he stayed in Germany the next year, helping to rebuild Germany. And he was asked to be mayor of a little town in occupied Germany. Our Frank, mayor of the town, by golly. Incredible stuff. And then there's Leslie Spector. Leslie, who was a small group leader. She taught with wisdom and compassion and humor, all the while managing to look radiant every time she taught. This Sunday last year, at the end of the services, she was in the sanctuary on her hands and knees with her credit card trying to get up the wax that had fallen on the floor of the carpet. Leslie, we've used different wax this year. Thank goodness. But we miss you still. We miss you. There's Gary Dykes, and there's Vic Levengood, and there's so many others. And that's just a snippet of their stories. But these names that we mention, these are our people. These are people that we remember today with joy and also great sadness, perhaps. But we celebrate that for them now, it is all joy. This day makes us realize that these are the ones we remember. But if we pause to think about all the people who have come before us, all those who will come after us, the diverse and wonderful and awesome people that God has created, we realize that that multitude of folks that God has gathered home is a large number. And this is just a small fraction. That great cloud of witnesses, that company of heaven that we speak about every week when we do communion with God and all the company of heaven. We praise your name and join their unending hymn. So All Saints' Day holds deeper significance as we pass year to year. And even when, maybe especially when, we are bound up in our own grief, I am so grateful for the promises of the gospel, two of which we have read today. One from John and one from Revelation 21. So let's look at those passages a little more. The passage I read from John 11, if we back it up a little to the beginning of chapter 11, we learn that Lazarus is ill, and Mary and Martha, his two sisters, are very worried, so they send an SOS message to Jesus, begging him to come to Bethany soon. But Jesus doesn't go right away. In fact, we don't know why. There could be many reasons for this, but verse 4 gives us a clue. It is all about the glory of God. No doubt Jesus knew what he was going to do, but Mary and Martha didn't know. And so 2 days later, when Jesus does finally arrive in Bethany, he meets Mary and Martha, who are both in great pain and grieving mightily for their brother who has died. And Jesus, too, weeps with them. Verse 21, Martha greets Jesus with these words, "If only you had been here, my brother would not have died." I don't know about you, but I do that all the time. If only she had gone to the doctor sooner, she could have gotten started on chemo before now. If only he didn't have so much to drink that night, he wouldn't be behind jail bars. If only she would go to counseling with me. If only I'd studied more for that exam. If only I'd done better in that interview. If only. That's what's behind the words of Martha to Jesus. Jesus, if only you had been here, you could have cured Lazarus. And Jesus meets her gaze, but instead of looking to the past, he invites her to look in this present moment, and he moves her toward the future when he says, your brother will rise again. And she said, well, sure, he will rise again in the last day. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is challenging Martha, and I think challenging all of us to change our if only to if Jesus. N.T. Wright puts it this way: if Jesus is who Martha is becoming to believe he is, if Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was promised by the prophets of old, if Jesus is the one that is to come into the world, if he is God's own Son, the one in whom the living God is strangely and newly present, if he is the resurrection and the life, then of course the dead will live. The story continues. The man came out, his feet bound, his hands tied, his face covered with a cloth, and Jesus said, untie him and let him go. I think this image of Jesus, this emerging from the tomb, is but a foreshadowing, to be sure, of all of the different ways that we too, you and I, will one day be unbound, be released, be set free, be liberated from the multitude of ways that death destroys life. For us as Christian people, we live on this side of the grave, but we also live in the shadow of eternity. Yes, it is true, our bodies will age, we may grow sick, and at some point, life will cease to exist as we know it. But we live in the light of eternity in our hearts, and that hope of resurrection, that new life begins now when we meet the one who is the resurrection and the life. Earlier this week, McGray and I were chatting about this text, and he had this insight. He said, eternity can shape our mortality. The future can inform our present. The promise of God's glory that is yet to be revealed, it can actually be experienced today. This is what we believe. This is what we say. So then, if that's true, then the way that we live our lives in this present moment has consequences for all eternity. I don't know about you, but I'm glad this story of resurrection and hope is in the Bible. Well, our other text from Revelation 21 is such a hopeful passage, and it's often read at funeral services. And quite honestly, though, once we say it's from the book of Revelation, many of us get a little freaked out because we're scared of that book. It has often been taken out of context and been used to scare a lot of people, and as the gospel claims have been distorted, and along the while, a lot of money has been made by certain individuals. So let's understand a little bit what's going on in the context of Revelation. And if we understand it, we might have just a little different feeling about the book. But it was written by a man named John, who lived a few years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And at the time that he wrote this, John was sitting in a prison cell that is built in the side of a mountain in a cave on the Greek island of Patmos. Now, I happened to visit there in 2007, and my pictures are pretty dark on the inside, but this is at the entrance of the grave. You can't really see it, but that is John. He's writing, and Jesus is visiting him, and this is his vision of the future. So we know that the book is actually a letter that's written to 7 different Christian communities, small churches in Asia Minor. And we know that those small Christian communities were undergoing severe persecution from the emperor, violent persecution from the emperor. And it's difficult for us to imagine the type of maltreatment that was going on. Christians who believed that God and not the emperor was supreme were treated as subversive traitors and tortured, and many were killed. So John is speaking to these scared and weeping Christians, and he uses the most bizarre language to illustrate his points. And the people understand that when he describes the whore of Babylon or the great beast, they know that he is speaking about Rome. So it is into this setting that John speaks, and he offers these words of hope to those who are living with despair. And he declares that there is light, even in the midst of your current darkness and this horrible oppression that we are experiencing. John Buchanan says this: the absolute power of the universe, it's not Rome with its military might and cruel authority. The absolute power is God, a God of mercy and peace and compassion and love. History is headed, human history, your history, my history, all history is headed not to Rome, but to God. And ever since that gospel writer penned those words, his words have brought comfort and hope to countless generations. People who are oppressed, people who are enslaved, people who are walking with a loved one on that journey towards death, people who are pondering their own deaths. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, a new one, a transformed one. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. It's a new city that's not marked by evil or sin and does not grow old. It's a city that will have continuous access to the builder, which is God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more, no mourning or crying or pain anymore. This restoration is like of a time before there was ever evil or suffering in the world. And then the one on the throne said, "Look, I am making all things new." Look, I am. It's present tense. I am making all things new. This new life then, once we know the resurrected one, the one who is the resurrection, this new life begins now, and eternity can shape our mortality, and the future can inform our present, and the promise of God's glory that is yet to be revealed can actually be experienced today with each other in these mortal bodies, even as we Christians live on the shadow of eternity. Praise be to God. In the last several weeks in our sermon series, we've been looking at the Wesley Covenant Prayer. And today's the last line of the series. And it's appropriate that we speak the last line of the series because it fits really well. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen. In other words, may the choices that you and I make today, may they somehow add to and be a part of all eternity. That's what we've been trying to talk about in this whole sermon series. What are the choices you are making for God this day? Are you setting yourself aside, your expectations, so that you can be filled by God's love? What are you doing today to be in closer relationship with God? So may the way that we live in this moment, this present moment, be shaped by the promise of tomorrow. And when we are no longer here, may our words and actions reverberate throughout eternity because of the way that we are choosing to live today in this present moment. Last October, Clark and I had the chance to worship out in San Francisco, California at St. Gregory of Nyssa Episcopal Church. Now, we were especially delighted to worship there because we'd read a book that one of their pastors, Sarah Miles, had written, Take This Bread. And we were so excited because she was actually preaching that day. So we were standing on tiptoe with enthusiasm because we were going to get to meet her, and we loved the book. So when we got there, the bright colors, the vibrant singing, the incense wafting through the congregation was intoxicating, to say the least. And all of that happiness and meaningfulness was pouring out into the church family. And during the communion liturgy, we were literally led from our chairs in a dancing, swaying motion till we all gathered around the communion table and we stood. Here, in fact, we've danced from the congregation over there to around the communion table here. Meanwhile, we were not alone because there were painted on the walls of this church saints, dancing saints. Of course, Jesus was leading the dancing, but his dance partners were many. That's Jesus up there. Happy dancing Jesus. I mean, there was Moses and Miriam, his sister. And these are all over the church walls. And there was Isaiah and King David. And there was Paul of Tarsus and Barnabas and Francis of Assisi and Anne Frank and Florence Nightingale and Sitting Bull and Sojourner Truth and Ella Fitzgerald and Desmond Tutu. I mean, there were so many, and it was so interesting to kind of pick out who they had chosen as saints to put up and remind them of the great circle of life. And there is space on their walls for more because this church is actively remembering this continual, encouraging circle of God's love and the promise of eternal life with Christ. On their website, it says, St. Gregory's Church invites people to see God's image in all humankind, to sing and dance to Jesus' lead, and to become God's friends. Being in worship, and in the midst of those saints, those who were standing near me seeking to live faithful lives, and those whose images were all around me up on the walls, encouraged me, and it brought me into an awareness of eternity that makes eternity wonderfully real. It was an awesome moment. This experience also challenged me to reflect on the way that I am living my life today. Am I taking relationships for granted, or am I putting effort into them? Am I speaking truth to power and words of hope so that systems change, so that the future saints who come along behind us will have a better world to live in? How are you living your life today to make it a better world? Recognizing that we all live in this tension between the past and the future, this experience encouraged me to sing and dance more intimately with Jesus as the lead, and to live my life in closer relationship with God and God's friends, the saints, those who have gone before us, and those with whom I rub shoulders now. I hope on this All Saints Sunday, you would be encouraged to do the same.